Okay, so without the reserve system, going back to the gold standard, each dollar was backed by a certain amount of gold.
In theory.
In theory.
Yeah.
So
as long as you never look, it's definitely in the vaults, like Schrodinger's gold, right? As long as you never ask for it, it's there, right?
Right. It was sort of generally accepted. Everybody sort of played as if, right?
Which when the United States have nuclear weapons and owns the United Nations and things, maybe you have other reasons to play along rather than just believing it on face. I think that's an important geopolitical context for that Bretton Woods moment. Sorry to interrupt, but yeah.
For sure. No, fair enough. So it was in theory sort of tethered or anchored, and there was constraints on the number of units of a currency that could be created because it needed to then go back to a number of ounces of gold, where we broke that relationship explicitly in the 30s and again in the 70s. And so I guess the question that's begged then is, what are the constraints on the number of units of money that can be created and move into circulation?
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that even when that gold standard was there, first of all, as I said, sovereigns could adjust it up and down when they wanted and things. It was a constraint on paper, but not necessarily a practical constraint.
And they did so, yeah.
And they did so regularly. Yeah. But also, that system of private credit that I started with exists on top of that, right? If you have 7 people and they all issue a private IOU and they all offset each other, nobody needs to have any gold, and you could do that at mass scale. And so if you're the US government and every time you issue a dollar bill, you need to sort of, at least in theory, have gold somewhere to back it. But if you charter a bunch of commercial banks who are basically quasi-public actors anyway, and they issue bank deposits, those bank deposits don't have to have a one-to-one backing with gold. So even if the base layer of the hierarchy, or the top of the hierarchy, depending how you want to look at it, even if that layer has some, in theory, tethering to gold, the actual whole monetary, ecosystem doesn't necessarily have to.
No, I hear
you.
But I guess
no constraints. Yeah.
The argument, though, I think that some would bring to bear on that is that the constraints for private sector creation of credit was the profit motive, right?
Yes.
Yes. So there was a constraint. It wasn't explicitly backed by any sort of reserve asset that was convertible into a fixed number of units, but the profit motive constrained the ability for, or the likelihood for, banks to create money in the form of credit, right? So when you then untether and real money, like money that the government issues,
let's say currency, maybe for clarity.
Currency. The government doesn't have the same constraints from the perspective of profit motives, right? So how should citizens think about how governments are constrained now that they're not actually physically constrained in the amount of currency that they can issue, because it doesn't need to be converted into any fixed quantity?
And how does that differ from how neoclassical economics thinks? Because I think this is key. A lot of us in finance have this sort of classical economics background, or at least general understanding. And I think it's key for us to make the distinctions and get on the same page here.
Agreed.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I think the first thing is, when you said it's constrained by profit, which I agree with, but it's important. It's not constrained by profit ex post, right? It's not that everything has to have been proved to have been profitable before it would have happened in the first place. It's not some time loop.
It's the ex ante application of profit.
That's right. And one of the things that someone like Hyman Minsky spent a lot of time talking about is those financial speculators or those financial investors can be highly irrational and self-reinforcing, that you think it's going to be profitable because it's generally profitable, or others think it's going to be profitable. And so what you actually can have is that private credit system not constraining itself, but spiraling out of control to these moments of crash, where in those moments of crash, it takes a public bailout to essentially reset the system. And so it's not that you had a kind of hard money base and then this sort of bubbling private credit that had a limit. It never really kind of tipped over the top of the saucepan. It was that you had this ongoing kind of
self-reinforcing
cycle.
Periods of exuberance and crises, crash, boom, and that was itself a source of ongoing instability, asset price inflation, all that kind of stuff. But to go to your question, there's the other part that I didn't mention is that, of course, states were not running balanced budgets the whole time. They were also issuing debt, and debt promised something different than currency, which is why I made that distinction just then. If you're holding currency, then you need as much gold in the vault. If you're issuing a 30-year bonds, then you only theoretically need the currency when it comes due in the future. And if a larger and larger share of public money, defined more broadly to include government debt and government currency, if a larger and larger share of the public money is in the form of debt that doesn't promise convertibility, then even under a gold standard regime, you could maybe run quite large deficits. That your constraints are not the constraints of gold per se.
That's true, but under that type of regime, a person could legitimately claim that all borrowing was, some people sort of say we're borrowing from the future, or this is a liability for our children, or that sort of thing. And under
I don't believe
standard that you might be able to sort of quasi-legitimately make that claim, right? You cannot.
No, you definitely can't
make that
today.
claim.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
I'm getting to that point, so thank you for bearing with me. But yeah,
no worries.
The government debt in that moment is another way around the sort of fiction of the hard constraint of gold. It creates its own problems because then you need a debt market, you need people to buy it, you need to offer interest, and if you're not providing the interest to the private sector, you need a central bank behind it to buy up the interest. So there's an arbitrage opportunity where you buy it from the fiscal authority, from the treasury, and then the central bank buys it on the back end, which is sort of maybe what you were getting at earlier. We often think of them as separate rather than as the left and the right hand of a larger entity. Mm-hmm. But yes, going off the gold standard essentially meant that from now we needed a new theory of restraint. Whether or not that theory matched reality, we need a theory of discipline. And what MMT proposes, and I think the last few years have really validated this, is that the true constraint is what's undesirable from a public policy perspective. That is to say, usually undesirable levels of inflation or currency devaluation, right? Foreign exchange devaluation or internal price pressure. Now, what the neoclassical story would say is anytime you print more money and it's not accompanied by, production, there's going to be inflation. So that's not a panacea. It's not a golden egg laid by the goose. It's not a free lunch. We're still under scarce resource constraints. And I think what MMT would say is there is a speed limit. There is a sort of real resource capacity as we experienced in the middle of a massive pandemic and supply chain crunch. And at a certain point, if you need more masks, you have to be actually making more masks. But I think the other thing they would say is if you look at the history, particularly the last few centuries, that we have been operating mostly below our potential. It was really only arguably maybe World War II where we really put pedal to the metal to produce as much as we could, squeeze every drop of productivity out of the whole economy, and we had a completely different kind of economy. We doubled real output in 6 years. We created 35,000 planes out of nowhere in a decade or less, right? We did things that were considered unfathomable. But in addition to being generally below our potential, as that's the default, not an exception. Neoclassical economics would say all of our models presume full employment, and then we add some frictions around it. The other part is that they would say that the place where that inflation comes from is from the quote-unquote money supply, which is usually focused on the government. Not the credit system, not the banks, not the shadow banks, not you and I making mutual credit obligations that actually increase overall purchasing power in the economy relative to otherwise. And that, I think, is a really huge difference that MMT is trying to emphasize, that yes, public money and fiscal spending is really important, but also it's only one source of demand in the whole economy. If you pumped a bunch of money in and people used it to pay debts they already owed, the people who held the debts have already got an asset. They've already got the debt. They would just be replacing the debt with money. It wouldn't change their wealth. Or if that money went straight into people's savings, they kept it under a mattress, it wouldn't do anything. Or if that was happening at the same time as you were constraining private credit, that there might actually be an offset there that would be more than sufficient to not cause any inflation. So that kind of crude quantity theory, that the way that we're keeping inflation at bay is not having too many, units out there, gets very complicated very quickly once you start questioning what is actually a unit that counts here. And the example that I give here, there's two examples. One is if we wanted to build a school, public school, in Nevada, and it's going to take laborers, it's going to take bricks, it's going to take electrical engineering, all that kind of stuff. And if there are shortages in those, then putting a little bit more pressure on that market might cause prices to increase, depending on how you structure it. Maybe you do rationing instead or something else. Or maybe you increase production through industrial planning. But if there is a certain amount and you're laying more claims on it and that gets reflected in the prices, then prices may go up there. But that's exactly the same as if right next door, somebody wants to build a casino. That's also going to take bricks and electrical engineering and laborers. And how are they going to finance that? They're going to go get a bank loan, and the bank is going to extend them credit. So suddenly, if you're talking about the real resource constraints of the economy, then bank credit and public money have similar claims on that. Now, even just as a real life experiment in the last 2 years, how many times have you probably heard, well, the problem is we did too much fiscal stimulus, right? We helped those damn poor people too much. We gave them $1,200 whole dollars that they could have in the middle of a pandemic. And now they spent it on, all these things like food, which they really shouldn't have spent it on, and gas to get to work, which they really shouldn't have done. We wanted them starving and stuck at home. And unfortunately, we were too nice to them. And now we're paying the price. How many of those people have looked out and said the problem is too much private bank lending was going on? None, virtually none, basically none. And if we do talk about it that way, how do we talk about it? We talk about it in the sense of monetary conditions were too loose, interest rates were too low. It was a bonanza for people to invest. And the answer then, of course, is just to raise the interest rate, which is essentially making credit more expensive. It's like a carbon tax approach. But if you understand, as you were saying before, that Treasury-Fed interaction, that Treasury central bank interaction, raising interest rates there is another way of saying paying more interest on government liabilities, government debt, and central bank reserves. Nowadays, the short-term interest rate, how does the Fed set it usually? It just says the overnight rate we're paying on excess reserve balances has gone up. That's literally a fiscal subsidy. If someone said, hey, I'm going to pay banks a big truck of cash every month, you'd say, hey, that sounds like a weird fiscal stimulus program, but all right. And then they say, hey, we're going to pay them interest on their reserve balance. You say, wow, that sounds like monetary policy. Thank God you kept that independent of fiscal policy. So there's always this interest income channel that's happening at the same time on the public money side as the cost of credit side when you raise interest rates. Now, if we had said, we're not going to raise interest rates because we don't want to have that contradictory effect. We're going to keep interest rates at zero, but we're going to tighten credit conditions by saying no more loans to fossil fuel companies, no more loans to this industry, or the leverage requirements on the banks are now doubled, or the liquidity requirements for non-banks is now doubled. Everyone likes to joke about Apple holding all this money on their balance sheet and not knowing what to do with it. Well, one way you might constrain future business investment to leave more room for public spending would be just say more companies have to hold more money on their balance sheet as a liquidity buffer for uncertainty and risk. So there's all sorts of ways that you could constrain private credit, private spending, that don't involve the carbon tax approach of interest rate adjustments, but we don't think about it that way. And so, the neoclassical model will keep you in that realm. And I think MMT tries to get you to a much broader conception. There's more to money than public money. There's more to credit than interest rates. And there's more to inflation and prices than just the quantity of goods or services.